Hello, I'm Francis Terry. I'm a classical architect who designs traditional classical buildings, and I'm with my son Joey, who studied environmental science for A level and has an interest in
Yeah,
environmentalism.
I mean, I'm very interested in sustainability and stuff like this. I'm no expert, I'm no activist, I'm not kind
Not
of
yet.
aspiring to be Greta Thunberg, but I've got an interest in it, so thought it'd be interesting to intertwine our interests, obviously
Absolutely.
architecture, and it's a very important topic, especially in the age of climate change. So,
Exactly.
the first question, what does the architect need to think about in terms of sustainability?
Well, there are really two strands to this. One is the building performance, and the other are the materials you use. The building performance is very much based around keeping the the building warm in winter and cool in summer, and obviously heating buildings up is a huge has a huge environmental consequence because that invariably uses fossil fuels or wood or whatever. So people uh, governments and policies encourage buildings that have a very good performance for not losing heat. So the main way that's done is through having a massive amount of insulation. Old houses like this have no insulation. They're just a brick wall with plaster on the inside, so heat can go straight through. But nowadays we have a brick wall and then a cavity like a space with insulation in it, and then there'll be another solid wall which could be either a timber stud wall or a concrete wall. So that makes a huge difference to heat loss. The other part of heat loss is the size of the windows. So if you've got really huge windows, obviously heat can go through them, and that can be helped if your windows are double glazed or even triple glazed, which is being encouraged nowadays. Windows are more of a concern for actually heat gain in summer because a huge window, the heat comes in and kind of magnifies over
Becomes a
time.
greenhouse.
Becomes a greenhouse, exactly. So that's another thing which people are thinking about. Along with the extra insulation, architects are encouraged, well, through legislation, to make their buildings completely airtight so that there's no drafts or anything, so that because there are drafts, obviously heat loss, like a building like this with shutters and so on, there's little bits of air coming in
Yeah,
and so on. My actual view, which is probably a kind of controversial
sure.
opinion, is that I mean, I was brought up in a house without central heating, Granny and Grandpa's house.
Yeah, yeah, I know.
Can be a
Freezing
little
cold,
cold,
but
yeah.
yeah.
But, it's just a matter of getting used to it,
Yeah, yeah.
really. I think we all feel that houses should be incredibly warm, but, historically, people wore hats and coats indoors. It's not a very easy sell, but neither is not eating meat.
Yeah,
Neither
yeah, yeah.
is, I don't know whether you have any view
Yeah,
on.
I think it's a bit of a problem really, an airtight house in the sense that you're really getting no draft and it's creating quite a stuffy environment
Yeah,
for
yeah,
everyone.
well, absolutely.
Um, and in a way, like if you can make one room very warm,
Yeah,
stay in
yeah,
there.
yeah,
I
yeah,
mean, human body gives off a lot of heat. If you could all
yeah,
stay in one room,
yeah,
will get warm,
yeah,
whatever. And yeah, the important places should really be warm. But I mean, when you're walking down a corridor for 5 seconds, it doesn't need to be boiling hot.
yeah. I mean, it's interesting because there's a lot of interest in people like Win Hof with the cold showers in the
Yeah,
morning and how cold is actually very beneficial to you. I'm obviously not talking about people who are ill and infirmed and so on,
yeah,
but for a normal person to experience being cold is not a problem. And I sometimes think that people are insulating these buildings to kind of high heaven so that people can wander around in a t-shirt in the middle of winter, which I don't think is good. And I also think part of environmentalism should be being in touch with nature.
uh-huh.
And it seems to me that if you're making an interior a kind of divorced
Sort of
environment,
microclimate.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, you're not part of nature, which I think is a problem.
yeah. On that Wim Hof thing, I think it's also important. You're gonna have to take sacrifices, in a sustainable
Yes.
lifestyle. For
Yeah.
example, meat. eating meat. I mean, controversial. So I mean,
Yeah.
giving up red meat or dairy or stuff like this is like, is a very sustainable way of living. But you're sacrificing comfort.
Well, it's right. It's a pleasure.
Yeah.
Ultimately, if it's healthy to live in a slightly cold house, it's a pleasure that you're missing out on, that joy of being hot. But well, like all these things, it's a hard sell. Or not flying in a plane is a pleasure you'll miss out on. Obviously these environmental rules are just closing off avenues of pleasure left, right, and centre. But anyway, it's an interesting. I suppose what I feel is that this obsession with airtightness and insulation. I just wonder whether it might come back to bite us in the future. There are a whole load of things which people thought was a great idea in terms of building, like putting asbestos in buildings. Yeah. That was what they were doing.
It's a nightmare.
Well, it's cancerous, it's whatever. And you worry about the long-term effects of some of these things. Like these houses that don't get enough drafts often have things like mold grows in them. There's a thing called black mold, and you can't get rid of it, and it gets into your mind, and it's a nightmare. So I think with everything there are side effects, and it's just how big those side effects are, and whether they can be mitigated. The other strand is building materials. I mean, obviously, me as a traditional architect, I'm going to have a slant on this, where I favour buildings materials that have been around a long time, and anti-artificial materials. But maybe you can pick me up.
I'll try.
If I'm being So obviously, stone is the most sustainable material, because that if you're in a stone area and you just build in stone, that there is no transport costs, very little manufacturing. That obviously is a very sustainable material. It's not a great insulator.
No.
So you will need to use it in conjunction with insulation. Brick, also a very good material, but that has to be heated. Although there has been some research recently that bricks, because firing bricks back in the day, back in Roman times, was incredibly expensive and difficult to do because they didn't have coal. So they weren't actually fired at a very high temperature. And those bricks have lasted a long time, and there are various advantages to them. Something that's important to bear in mind, and this comes from the traditional architecture side, is that before the Industrial Revolution, before coal, people just they had to live without fossil fuels. Yeah. So there are all these houses are built in this village and wherever else with no fossil fuels. So these are kind of exemplars of how you can build without fossil fuels, because they actually were. So I think there's an awful lot to be learned from traditional building in terms of using local materials. They always used local materials because transport was impossible. Also how buildings were ventilated in summer. There's a lot of embedded knowledge. Just keeping going on the building materials, obviously timber is an excellent material. If you think of a house like this, very often the outside walls will be made of brick, and then the roof, the floors, the internal walls would all be done in timber. Only the fireplaces would be done in brick. So and timber's amazing because it actually sequesters carbon within it. It's a carbon sink.
Yeah.
So if you have enough timber just sitting around, you will absorb a lot of the carbon from the atmosphere.
So like combating climate change, as well as providing a house.
Exactly.
But yeah, as you're saying, it's moving on from the building materials. You're talking about how, traditional architecture. I mean, before coal was even used for construction. I mean, like coal was discovered in the 1700s, I think.
Yeah.
But I mean, it wasn't even main like energy source until probably late 1800s, early 1900s. So, what can we take away from the traditional ways of architecture and how they built buildings to, kind of insulate themselves, passive heating?
Yeah. I think, I mean, as you can see from old paintings, people wore a lot of clothes in winter. They basically went around with bedding on them. I mean, it's that kind of scale, and a hat. Again, as we said, not a popular sell, but that's what they did. They also put a lot of cloth on walls.
Yeah, I saw that on the lecture
Robin
you sent me.
Pender.
Yeah,
she's very interesting about the history of.
But how does that work? The cloth on the walls, kind of.
I think you're making a kind of microclimate within a room, so that any small amount of heat just stays in there. Right. Rather than escapes. So it's a kind of little insulated box. And I guess it's like those beds with the sides and the roof. You make a very warm little place within a freezing cold castle. It's effectively what they're doing.
Yeah, she made an interesting point about that, saying how we completely ditched the cloth on the since the plague. That's just kind of got rid of cloth on the wall as a way of insulating a building.
Yeah.
And she also said, back then they didn't, they made it so it was hot enough for them. There wasn't any of this like thermostat where you could change the exact right temperature, just the right amount.
So it felt right.
Yeah, right.
Exactly.
So maybe we're too specific.
Well, I guess it's the measurable. You have things you can measure like temperature, but it goes a little deeper than that. That you can feel warm in a space, but actually the temperature's quite low. Yeah. I think that the cloth thing is interesting. I think having cloth on walls is a really great for acoustic as well. When I go to a restaurant, I always pick a restaurant where there's kind of lots of upholstery and carpet on the floor. Because no, I do definitely, because if someone drops a spoon, this is slightly off topic here. Someone drops a spoon on a hard floor where all the surfaces are, it echoes for hours.
There is no way you pick out a restaurant because of that.
I do definitely. No, I do. No, I do. I mean, maybe it's my age, but you go into a restaurant and it's all
you're on the phone and you're going. Well,
no, I've got a few favourite restaurants like Sartoria in the city, which is it's got lots of curtains and so on. This is completely off topic, but
we'll get back to the sustainable.
We'll get back to sustainable, but no, I think there should be a revival in cloth on walls for sustainability and for acoustic. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, and this was something that Robin Pender said, is that the palette of materials were so small until the Industrial Revolution. Or in fact, even until the 20th century, you had stone, brick, timber, slate, tiles, but basically rocks and baked clay, and well, you've obviously got thatch and things like that. But thatch is a type of timber, really, it's a type of wood or branches. So you've got these very limited, very natural materials that were sourced locally. Then you come into the modern age. And there's steel and glass become the thing, the way of constructing. Yeah. Steel and glass obviously have a massive amount of energy in processing them. I mean, glass was not used for hundreds of years because the kind of energy you were talking about was just not attainable, or you could only. It was just unbelievably difficult to do anything glass. And steel, similarly, is kind of massive energy needed. And same,
And a massive energy needed to sustain these kind of buildings. Which have
true.
Glass and steel. I mean, you look at like kind of a massive skyscraper compared to a kind of a medium-sized building. I mean, all the energy used to kind of clean the windows or work the lifts.
That's a good point.
So I think it's these buildings they take up far more energy than.
That's a good point. The cleaning of buildings. Yeah. That is another thing. That if you have a glass building, think of all the detergents that need to go on that on a regular basis. But the big problem is the heat gain. You have a completely glass facade, and I remember on one project we did some calculations. It was on a modern project that we were loosely involved in, and the heat gain was just off the scale. I mean, to be honest, you could bake bricks in it almost. It's just
bake a fried egg.
Yeah, you could. It was just crazy because of this greenhouse effect. If it gets hotter and hotter and hotter and hotter. So really, the thing about windows, and I kind of would say this, but they need to be big enough to light the room, but not so big that you get massive solar gain and heat loss.
Yeah.
That would be my feeling on that.
Something we haven't talked about yet, which is also a very important topic in terms of sustainable architecture, is the longevity of a building. I mean, even you look everywhere and you see the older buildings that are still stood strong. I mean, even the church in Dedham is still knocking about, and there's
500 years old.
Yeah, and there's plenty of housing estates that just get knocked down after 60 years of being there.
Yes.
So, yeah, what's the difference?
Okay. Well, I guess there is a problem in that people have a very short-term view of building, and you will get companies or developers who design a building for a 60-year cycle, particularly with towers, that they get planning permission for this building, they have a lease for 60 years, that's all they care about. And then the building can just fall to bits after that, it's not a problem for them. But the result is you get, and I've seen this in the city, you get the newer buildings are the ones that get torn down, and you get 60s buildings, 70s buildings, sometimes 80s buildings are torn down. So I think the longevity is critical, and you think of the amount of building waste that goes into landfill as a consequence of tearing down buildings. I think that when people should try and reuse buildings rather than build new buildings, but when you are doing a new building, you should build it forever.
Yeah.
And I would argue using traditional building methods, because those are the ones that are going to last and stand the test of time.
So how do you avoid, building materials ending up in landfill?
Well, I think you build well using traditional materials. This house, for example, you could, if you wanted to, take it down brick by brick, reuse the bricks. It's done in lime mortar. You could reuse the timber. The whole thing could be recycled. The trouble is, with this very well-intentioned idea of trying to reduce heat loss, where you have these very complex walls that have cavities and insulation and all of these different
all
things.
Of mixed materials.
Or mixed materials. It's a bit like when you go to the recycling place.
Yeah.
What bin would you throw that in?
How do you separate?
You can't separate them. So that's a real problem. And I think that I certainly think making thick walls, doing details where rain naturally falls off. I think the trouble is there's been a bit of a modern aesthetic where there are no mouldings, and the mouldings are actually functional, so that you have a cornice, and that is designed so that the water drips off the facade rather than sustaining it. So there's a whole load of wisdom which has been rather ignored. One thing we haven't talked about is concrete, which is, I mean, everyone knows is a terrible building.
Stay away from concrete.
Well, yeah. I mean, the trouble is, it's a pretty good material for a lot of things. You can't do a basement without concrete. I mean, I think in a way, in all these things, you need a sense of balance. I think if you only look at heat loss, then you've got a problem. If you just say it has to be traditional, nothing else, it's like everything you do has a little bit of modernism in it and a little bit of traditionalism. And I'm just saying maybe the dial just needs to shift a bit, because it isn't a high-tech solution.
I mean, in terms of beauty as well. I mean, you've said to me a lot of times, why would you knock down a beautiful building, beautiful classic building compared to some sort of cheese grater looking skyscraper? It's like it becomes kind of a monument almost.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that adds on to the longevity,
I think that's another point, is that people don't knock down beautiful buildings. So, and also, I guess beauty's on the eye of the beholder. It's not something I 100% agree with, actually, because I think that you don't want to have a building that looks eccentric or strange. You want it to just be timeless. Timeless proportions, symmetry, a good balance of wall to window. That's what you want, and something that you don't want a building with someone to say, oh, that's very 80s. That's not my taste. I want something of now. You want something that's kind of goes deep beyond that.
Another thing we haven't talked about. I mean, this is a bit out of your field, but I mean, it's easy to kind of pick out one house and just say, oh, if that was traditional, it would be sustainable. I mean, it's a house in the country, it's going to be more sustainable than a whole housing estate. How would you go about creating like a cheap, sustainable
very good
estate
point
for the
Well, I think the thing is, all of this sustainability, whatever form you do it in, you do the airtightness, you have a thick wall, or whatever, all of them cost more than doing the cheapest thing.
Of course.
And building a house is massively expensive, and it's only getting more expensive now because the cost of materials have gone up hugely. There's a shortage of labour. I don't know how, you see all these very cheap houses being built, but to be honest, I'm amazed they can do them for the price and then still sell them at a profit. I don't really see the housing, these kind of bad guy housing people, housing developers as to be honest, I think it's miraculous that you can get a house for that, and they are tinnily built, and if you want a house to have longevity, it has to be very well built.
Yes.
And that costs. And it will probably cost more than that house, more than you can sell it for.
Yeah.
Which is a huge problem.
So obviously landowners, they don't want to
I don't know. I mean, you almost need some sort of government incentive or something to say that, houses need to be built to a certain quality. And we understand that the market just can't do that. I don't know. I mean, that is a problem. I'm not in politics, so...
So moving on from building on how to create a sustainable settlement, in terms of not just buildings themselves...
Yes.
In relation to how, a person might go to work or a person might travel, basically, how can we incorporate, everyday life to a point where the buildings kind of facilitate it?
Yes. Beyond their walls.
Yeah.
Yes.
So in terms of less carbon footprint with going by car, if you can cycle to places, if you can walk to places, and it's how do you urban plan something so it's facilitates a sustainable lifestyle?
Okay, that's a very good question. And something that's been a big concern to Prince Charles, now King Charles, in his village in Poundbury. Although everyone talks about the traditional architecture there, and a lot of modernist architects find it a complete joke and it's a pastiche and blah, blah, blah. One of the absolute motivating factors for that town was trying to knit in places to work, light industrial units, places for children to play, so that effectively you could live in Poundbury and not have a car. And which is actually what you want, the nicest places to live, say, Cambridge or somewhere like that. It's a cyclable place. And you hear it's one of those things, or one of the really nice things about, say, Amsterdam is everyone cycles around. So there is that thing, and again, slightly like the materials, is that what I hope is that through sustainability, that architecture in our lives will be enriched by these obstacles, actually going to make things better. So that is a huge interest, and there is a group of people called the New Urbanists who, because before this there was some modernist architects who basically said what you should do is just build towers and have a grid of roads. And it's completely going against that. And again, looking at how traditional settlements work, because people, you couldn't travel. So how did they do things?
So they look back at past communities and how they
absolutely, like this high street or or a small town, or just to see what lessons can be learned. Because although we're very different in many ways from the people before us, in many ways we're extremely similar. We're much the same height. Our heads are much the same position relative to the ground. There's a whole load of things, and obviously there are health benefits to a life of bicycling and walking, and rather than sitting in a car all the time.
And to kind of round it off, or come towards the end, it's obvious that these are massive things that need to be resolved in architecture, and there's lots of new ways that's possible. But are architects are they wised up to this? What are they doing now to really move towards a sustainable life?
Buildings and lifestyle. Yeah. Well, I think architects are concerned, like everyone is, and everyone wants to do the right thing. There is some debate about what the right thing is, like all these things are. And I guess my criticism of government legislation on this is there is too much focus on individual things. I mean, in a way, it's the scientific method where you have a graph and you're measuring A against B. It's the difficult thing is to think of everything. Think of heat loss, think about ventilation, think about everything all at once, in a way which people did before they had coal in the first place. And think about communities which allow for cycling and walking and so on. Think of it in the round and not just attack individual problems, because I think that's where you get issues, where in your effort to make a sustainable window, for example, you make a window that's only going to last 5 years. If you take double glazing, the minute they messed up, that's it. So then you have to chuck that in landfill. That should be balanced against the cost of making glass, the carbon in that. It's a very difficult thing, and I think the solution is a sense of balance about all these things. So, for example, I would say, don't have no heating, have less heating. It's slightly like eating meat. I'd say you should eat meat, but not too much. It's how to balance all of the conflicting issues and do it in a way which will make your life better. Is my feeling.
It's something that is very important.
Yes.
Obviously, and I think you mentioned them, like dietary changes you make. To try to be more sustainable. I mean, it was 40% of CO2 production comes from
building. 40%, which is colossal
annually, and you never hear about that.
No.
So I think maybe the importance needs to be kind of shown to everyone, because everyone focuses on cycling everywhere, or trying to cut out red meat. But 40% is almost nearly half the CO2 production globally.
It is from building.
It's something that needs to be really combated now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a very good thing to say. You shouldn't do temporary buildings. Buildings should be permanent. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much, Jerry.
No problem.
Okay, thank you.